Karen, it's so great to talk to you. This is such a relevant topic to talk about divorce. And it's also kind of one of those topics that people, don't want to talk about as much as they should. And there's so much involved. And you really are an expert. Not only have you had your own personal experience, but you help people with getting through the whole issue of divorce. So there's so many topics we can cover, but you're the expert. And I just want you to just start by giving my audience a little bit of a background about who you are, what you did, and why you do what you do.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me on. I love your show. I think like so many, out of my pain came my purpose. And so I was not young. I was 34 when I met my husband. And it was only a couple of years in when it was just really tumultuous and confusing. I went through a 3.5-year, very high conflict divorce, attorneys, police, CPS, the whole bit.
Wow.
And my children were very young. They weren't even in grade school when we started. And my ex was very, very angry and offended that I chose to divorce. And so out of that experience, I say two things, Caroline. I say that it was a living hell and it was the greatest gift that I ever had. Wow. And it led me to do the work that I do, because when I came out the other side, I felt like I was so pleased with myself. I was like, wow, I am the best version of me I've ever seen so far. And then I thought, there has to be something more important for me to do in the world. I couldn't have gone through this. And I was selling commercial printing, ink on paper. And I was like, nope, it's got to be something more important. And I went into life coaching. And of course, you have to niche. And I was a child of divorce. And so I thought, wow, I've kind of been designed to do this divorce transition work. And I started back in 2010. And in the last 3 or 4 years, as there are more and more divorce coaches out there, I have pivoted me and my team to the high conflict, because it's that much more complex. It takes longer. It slays people more. And it's very different than your garden variety divorce.
Okay, well, that's a great place to take the next question to talk about, garden variety divorce versus high conflict divorce. It's quite interesting how you've labeled those.
Yeah.
Or labeled.
And so the truth is, divorce has conflict. So there's rarely a no conflict divorce. There are those couples who just mutually come, but most of the time we all deal with fear because it's such a huge transition, and conflict because there's a reason we're splitting up and divorcing. So that's your kind of garden variety. There's going to be some fighting. There's going to be some displeasing behavior on both sides. When I talk about high conflict divorce, there's a couple of things. One is, if you've married a person who either has a personality disorder, they have addiction, alcoholism, trauma, significant trauma, they're showing up as a less pleasing version of themselves, right? And so all of the things that come up, the black and white thinking, the blaming and accusing, all of these things that we deal with. And so the partner has his or her problems, but then those of us who marry into it, we're coming from our own dysfunction in our family of origin. So for me, my dad was an alcoholic, a very jolly, lovely one, but an alcoholic. My mom was 24 and had 3 babies in diapers. She was a rageaholic. She had no skills or coping mechanisms for dealing with dad working a lot, dealing with him drinking a lot. Her mother was off the boat from Italy, her mother and father. So what did she have? So then that's how we were raised, in a household with a lot of conflict, a lot of unconscious behavior on both sides. And my experience has been, whatever our experience of intimate love is as children, we almost unconsciously find it as adults. And then we run the same script, right? And so when I talk about high conflict, you're dealing with someone who's come from whatever trauma and dysfunction, and then attracted to somebody else with their own trauma and dysfunction. And so we're generally a hot mess.
And we're a hot mess anyway. I mean, generally, just there's no human who's exempt from that. Often when we talk on this podcast, one of the things that I try to always stress is that it's okay to be a mess. That's why it's called cleaning up the mental mess, because no one is, we've all got something. we've all got not just something, we've all got lots of stuff going on. And obviously then you add undealt with traumas, as you've explained, and then you add the trauma of divorce. I mean, it's like we've had family members who've gone through divorces, and they cried so much that they damaged their eyes and, won't ever get married again. And there's so many sad things. So can you talk a little bit more about, how do you help people? What do you do? What can you help someone? Because there will be people for sure listening and watching today that are either going through or just have or going to, what can you,
So I'm going to start this with, so the way we approach it at Journey Beyond Divorce is there's the outer journey. There's the 5 stages of divorce, deciding to leave, telling your spouse, telling the kids, figuring out the custody, the finances, all of that. And that's where people focus all their energy. And most people feel like they're divorcing the problem.
Okay.
But Forbes put out a survey last year. 50% of first marriages end in divorce. 67% of second marriages end in divorce. 73% of third marriages end in divorce. We're not divorcing the problem. We are the problem, or part of the problem. And so what we do at Journey Beyond Divorce is we say the inner journey is as important, if not more important, than the outer journey. We want to help you understand the finances and the legalities and the co-parenting. Absolutely. But if you don't look at your part, the baggage you brought to the table, the behaviors that haven't served you, the thinking that's stinking, the emotional dysregulation that causes you to be like my mom. I was very much a rageaholic. So if we don't attend to all of that, then you're going to go through all of this pain and you're only going to get a little bit of the promise. You're going to be free, but only for a little while until you remarry. And then 67% of you are going to get divorced. And then you'll remarry and 73% of you are going to get divorced.
Those statistics are frightening.
Crazy. And so from my perspective, and one of my greatest desires is to lower the second and third marriage divorce rates, but even more than that, to break generational chains. So, I used to blame my mom, and I still have work to do there. But the truth is, she did her best, and she was raised by an Italian off the boat who lived on a farm in Italy. And so she did her best. And so when we can have some grace and say, okay, I am where I am, but what can I do about it? How can I be the best version of myself so that I can pay it forward to my children, so that I could teach my children healthy communication, healthy boundaries, how to handle difficult personalities, how to communicate in a way that, so all of these things enable you to be free and live your best life after a really, really hard divorce. You're going to go through the hard either way. So let's have the promise at the end.
I like that. And I'd like you to talk now about get specific. So give us an example, maybe a story that you just make up, a combination, or a fictitious story, or just a general example. And like practical, what does that look like? What you've just said, what does that look like in someone's life? So let's say someone's come to you, and whatever scenario, you can create the scenario. I don't want to create the scenario for you.
No. There's plenty. And I work with men and women. So I'm going to start with a fellow that I've worked with, and he was in a 20+ year marriage, and he had a huge heart for the fact that his wife had a lot of trauma, had some mental health issues, but he was berated and belittled for so many years. And so a lot of times, men and women, maybe a little bit more men, he cared more about taking care of her than taking care of him. And so part of the coaching, as he kept saying, I don't know why she does, and she does, and she does. And I was like, we can't help her. Let's talk about you, and really one of the big questions, Caroline, I'll ask clients early on, what do you need? Most of these people, they haven't been asked that question. They haven't thought about it. It's like needs, my needs. Oh my God, I don't even know how to answer that question. And so getting people to understand, when I ask you a question, you tell me what your husband thinks or what your wife thinks. That means they're squatting between your ears. You have lost access to your own mental space. And so you are not even thinking your thoughts. You're not even using your beliefs, values, and priorities to make decisions, because you've vacated to them. And so the work that we do is helping people reclaim their mind. What do you believe? What do you need? And then on the other side, how do you behave when you're triggered? And rather than saying, well, if he didn't do A, B, and C, what's the trigger? Is it a disrespect trigger? Is it an insecurity trigger? Is it an unforgiveness trigger? Like, what are the triggers that we can work on so that you can heal that, so that you can not take other people so personally? And so this is a very gentle, slow unfolding, but these are some of the conversations. Boundaries. I would say that I've yet to meet someone who's come to me, who's in a high conflict situation, who has any understanding or skill of boundaries. It's a foundational need.
Foundational need, and also interesting because there's just so much out there. The market's flooded, from Instagram to books to therapists talking about this to podcasts on the need for boundaries and what they are. So it sounds to me like there's almost like this knowledge that people have. They know what boundaries are or whatever, but in terms of applying it in their own life, have you seen it? Do you see that people like know about it, but the application in their own life is missing?
Yeah. So I have a little 1-week mini course that I do. That's a 5-day boundary boot camp. And for a while I was doing it live. And so it was so interesting, the questions people would come with. So first they'd say, I'm trying to set a boundary with my wife, but she won't do what I'm telling her to do. And it's like, okay, well, that's not a boundary. You're trying to control. So even when people think they know boundaries, the difference between trying to control someone else and trying to set a boundary. And I think foundationally, like I start with people and I say, when I hear you say, he made me feel, she made me do, that's an internal broken boundary. Unless someone has a gun to your head, no one's making you feel or do. And so really helping people understand on a foundational basis that, you know, your childhood experience and your life experience is what makes you feel. So we have to look at that. And so whether it's, how do I get my ex to stop talking about the divorce in front of the kids, or how do I have less conflict in the house after I disclose that I want a divorce and we're all living under one roof? And without the skill set, as you could imagine, it's like a bonfire going wild. I mean, I say people toss emotional grenades across the room and shrapnel flies everywhere.
And the kids get hit in the process.
And the kids get hit.
And then the parents feel so guilty about that because no parent wants to hurt their child. And they're so caught up in this intense emotional brokenness because you have that connection. And then all these years later, I mean, I know an example, I'm just thinking of an example of a friend of mine who's been married for over 50 years. And the husband has walked out with some younger woman after 50, well, I think it's 54 years that they've been together. I mean, how do you even process that? You know, and then the kids are taking sides and, you know, that it's just so, to watch this happening and unfold is just so incredibly sad.
I had one woman, I'll call her Angie, married 36 years. And so, you know, it's interesting. You can have emotional abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, financial abuse. So she was married to a very successful physician who would hold his hand over the tax return and she had to sign without seeing what their income was. But this was a really sharp woman who used to like have a pretty high powered position. Over 36 years, she really lost herself. And maybe we worked together for 2 years. She was a rock star. And as she did this work and started like focusing on herself and working on her communication and her boundaries to adult children, she ended up so brilliant at the end. She was late 60s, so excited about the next chapter of her life, ended up with a really good settlement because she kept her head about her and she was able to be strategic. And so the work that we do does have both that external positive outcome. But from my perspective, looking at that one individual, I don't care how much money she ended up with. She had her life back. She had her voice back. She had her mind back. She had a brilliant relationship with her young adult children because of the work that she did.
I mean, so that's the thing. The key is the work that she did. One of the things that comes up a lot, and I know it's one of the comments that you've made before, and that's about the codependency. I mean, this is such an interesting thing because we know children initially are co-regulated and they're codependent, and then they get more and more self-regulated, and then eventually we get into a relationship, and obviously there's always a little bit of codependency, and there's a healthy amount of it. But you make a comment, and I'm just going to read it here. Codependency is a magnet for disordered and dysfunctional relationships, and the secret to attracting healthier partners. So I'd love you to talk about that, because codependency comes up a lot. I think it's also a word that's bandied across social media with a level of understanding, but not maybe a full level of the impact, because there's a positive and negative side as there is to everything.
Absolutely. So let's take our children, right? I can give up something that I wanted to do because I want to serve my child. Mm-hmm. That is coming out of a place of high energy love. That is not codependent. That is caretaking, caregiving in a positive way. Mm-hmm. If I am doing something, if I'm giving up something because I'm afraid you're going to be angry with me, because I'm afraid I'm going to lose your love, because I'm afraid of losing out, if I'm coming from that low energy fear based, then I'm doing it to get something or to hold on to something. That's the codependency. So then you take someone who was raised in a dysfunctional family. They were taught, be quiet so that you don't upset mommy, caretake daddy because his feelings are hurt, whatever it is, right? We develop our codependency, right? We've lost our innocence. Now we're parenting our parents. And then you grow up and you go out and you look for that guy or gal that you're falling in love with. And you attract somebody who's naturally taking or receiving, because you're a giver. And so magnetically, we end up together, and it's like, oh, he needs me. Oh, I can fix him, right? And this is the kind of thing that happens. And the person who is the taker or receiver, I'm perfect. I'm all giving. I used to say when I was dating earlier, I would say, like, I'm not low maintenance. I'm no maintenance, as if that was a good thing. As if anyone should be no maintenance and have no needs and no desire for receiving. But that's how I was, that was what I came out of.
And raised as just in our patriarchal societies, that woman, suppress your need for, right, which is unfortunately,
right. Which is why more women are codependent to begin with, is because it's both societal as well as what's happening. But that's the magnet that I'm talking about. And the other thing, one of the books, Getting the Love You Want, do you know Harville Hendricks and Helen Hunt? They do imago therapy, and he described how we actually fall in love with someone who has the wounds of our mother and father, all unconscious, right? And then in a healthy relationship, we grow and mend. But in these unhealthy relationships, it's like pouring salt in the wound.
And this gets worse and worse.
It gets worse and worse.
That's why sometimes, here's the scenario. Sometimes you can have a situation, and I know from when I practice clinically and stuff as well, and just stories of people's lives, that you can have a situation where everyone's broken in some way, which we already established. Right. So I want to throw the scenario at you. And so then you have someone who's potentially very codependent and doesn't really get over that, and goes, even as a young person, starts getting into relationships that are also codependent, and then they meet someone who's codependent and also very broken, like all of us, but exceptionally broken and maybe involved in something or whatever. And that person's also codependent. And then the one who goes there, you've got two codependent people, both wanting codependency, but also wanting to fix each other. And how that can potentially spark success or spark destruction. I don't know. I'd love to have your opinion on those two scenarios, and what would make the difference? What would make it work and what would make it not work?
Yeah, I think the beautiful thing that would make it work is if they were willing to look in the mirror and work on themselves. I think that no matter what scenario you put on the table, any two people, even like moms and teenage daughters, have a really hard time with each other. If everyone's willing to say, well, rather than me blaming and accusing and saying you're the problem, if I can look at myself, if I could just see what is that need. And then with two codependents, you might have enough safety, right? Because I think that's the key. It's like, is it safe? So I was married to somebody who had major anger management. There was never safety in having those conversations. If I shared vulnerably about myself, it would be used as, as a weapon in the next fight, in the next interaction. Wow. So I think that in order for that to happen, and it can happen, both have to be open to doing that personal internal work and creating that safety where you can be really vulnerable to say, my little girl is scared right now because of X, Y, and Z, and this is what I need from you, or the space I need. And because I think as codependents, we can take things very personally when it's like, that's his issue. I don't have to take it personally. I just need to create space for him to do his thing.
Well, they're in a relationship, so you're already affecting each other. So there has to be some level of negotiation and taking responsibility. So what I'm hearing you say, which I really like, because this is really the work as a psychoneurobiologist, the whole mind, brain, body. You've got to use your mind. Your mind drives everything. Your brain and body just follow suit. So it's got to start. We've got to put that mirror up, as you mentioned it, and we've got to be able to look at ourselves. So I'm hearing you say that the major thing with dealing with divorce, once it's happened, is to work on yourself, not that you're trying to put the blame on yourself. Am I right? You're trying to understand yourself and see what was the pattern in yourself that generated that relationship so that you don't go into the second and third disaster.
Absolutely. And what I say to people is there's no fault and blame. Nothing about looking at yourself is fault and blame. When you come from, and obviously dysfunction's its own spectrum, right? So when you come from some kind of dysfunction, you're going to be set up to play that out until your mindfulness, your awareness is at a level where you can go, oh, I can do something differently here. Where my power is, not them, where I have no power, right? Like everyone's trying to fix them. And it's like, you're powerless there. Divorce is generally like there's so little control in divorce. The only way to feel empowered going through a divorce is to focus all of your energy where you have power. You. When I can focus all of my energy on me, I can make a huge impact. I can feel more empowered. I can feel more effective. I can feel more confident in myself. And I could be really moving the ball forward regardless of what the other person does. When I'm focusing all of my energy there, it's like grabbing at the wind. It's just so frustrating.
That's very good. It's a very good point. Just in terms of that working where the power is with yourself, which is just so true. We can't change your story, but we can change what's inside of us. There's also that tendency in any kind of conflict, relationship conflict, is to self-blame. And we mentioned about blame a few moments ago. So there's power there to help talk about we have power to talk about ourselves, but maybe there's self-blame. So how do you help someone who's in self-blame, especially someone who's come from a very narcissistic, someone who's shown a lot of narcissistic behaviors, which I know you talk about as well. So could you talk about?
I think that the pivot is from self-condemnation to self-compassion.
Oh, lovely. I like that. Yeah.
Self-compassion is really hard when you don't have self-love, right? And so part of the work is, I used to call myself an effing idiot, like 1,000 times a week. Now I cringe at the thought of it, but that's where I started. That's the human being I was when I was married to my spouse who had his own issues. And so growing into I deserve gentle kindness required me to do that, what is called that inner child work. I really needed to connect with, there was a little girl inside of me that since her childhood was scared, hid, tried to please everyone, was the peacekeeper. That little girl doesn't need me beating her up. That little girl needs to somehow integrate with my adult self. And the only way that's going to happen, I actually referred to the inner child as like a kitten hiding behind a couch. You can't be like, come on, what? No, you have to very gently, very sweetly, very softly invite them out. And it's the same thing with this work. If you're self-condemning and self-critical, baby steps to being self-compassionate. Where can you find some gentle kindness for yourself? Where can you begin to see that this is not your fault, that whatever trauma you went through in your life created the way you are right now, and be kind about it. When we self-condemn, we push ourselves down. When we have self-compassion, we levitate up. It's all emotional energy. So we want people levitating into, forgiveness, peace, joy, absolute passion, not going down into like victim and anger, and,
the dark, it's sort of the tunnel that it just goes round and round in a circle and just makes people worse and worse all the time. So if you had to say to someone, if someone's listening now that is about to go through a divorce or just has gone, or whatever, has been maybe a while ago or something, what would be the first steps that you would recommend someone took in healing?
I read a saying once that's...
Sorry, so that was someone that came to you, whatever. What's the first thing that you would do, and a great piece of advice for people to start?
Yeah. So one of the most amazing sayings that I read when I was doing my own self-help is every upset is a setup for personal work.
Yeah, that's great. That's one that I've heard very often. It's lovely.
And so I really begin talking to people to say, every time you're triggered, like if you could create a pause and just take time to feel it in your body, what's going on in your head. And so I really start with people to say, because a lot of times we're working on that reclaim your mind too. So it's like slowing things down enough to say, we know what's going on over there. Let's slow things down and see what's going on with you. And pretty quickly, people can begin to take a pause, and even baby steps, they've already got a win. And I've got them focusing on them and their progress. And so they might come back to me the next week and say, I bit my tongue bloody one time and I stepped away and I realized X, and I was able to deal with it differently. And so when you're entering divorce, it's overwhelming. It's scary. The uncertainty, Caroline, it's like, how much am I going to see my kids? How much money am I going to have? Am I going to have a roof over my head? Am I going to ever talk to my in-laws again? Am I going to lose some of my friends? I mean, it's so multidimensional that it's utterly overwhelming. And so baby steps, and the best baby step is always to say, let me start with myself. Yes, he or she is being displeasing. They're doing things that are upsetting or wrong or unfair or whatever. No agency over there. Start with yourself, and you will immediately begin to build some self-confidence and begin to feel empowered.
I like that. So people just in sort of relation to that question. So if people haven't done that, when they come to you, can you pick that up? That if people have suppressed or pushed it down, just haven't dealt with it, they've just kind of gone into the motion, as you said in the beginning, of just dealing with the practical side of divorce. But when they haven't done, where they've just pushed their own feeling, there's been obviously tears and frustration and anger. But if they haven't fully processed that and they've just kind of shoved that down, like exploding, is that, do you see quite a lot of that? That's not a situation.
I would say, it's interesting because this is like the lion's share of our individuals. There's a very small percentage that can't get unstuck. There's a very tiny percent. I had one woman I tried for so long, just through email and text, and she was locked and loaded in this place that was just going to take her nowhere. And it was heartbreaking because it was like you have the key to the prison door in your hand and you won't use it. But I would say it's maybe 5%. And I've been doing this for 14 years. The vast majority of people are, if they're even a little bit open and you can give them a quick win. And for many of us, it's like, I just didn't know. I went into a 12-step program. I was sitting in a room and they started saying the serenity prayer. And I turned to my girlfriend and I was like, I have no idea what serenity is. Like, I literally couldn't have defined the word because my life had just been so chaotic. So it's like, that was a crack in the door for me. And so everyone has a different crack in the door, but what we try to do is give a lot of different support, like this, little baby steps that you can take, like reclaiming your mind, like beginning to set boundaries, like taking a look at yourself and saying, well, if I listed my needs and my propensities that I wish I could change, like already you have some place to start. And the divorce will unfold and all of that will help you. And I think that's part of it. I would say the other thing, Caroline, is across the board, a lot of people come to us with no hope.
No.
And I have so much hope and I'm so driven to help that I have had so many people say, I'm hiring you and I'm working with you. I got no hope, but you seem to have enough for both of us. So I'm going to use that as my life raft right now. And then I have in my podcast, I have a series called Voices of Celebration, maybe 30 interviews now. Every one of the men and women. This is the worst thing that ever happened in my life. And at the end, when I'm interviewing them, oh my God, I am sitting here saying this is the best thing that happened to me. Not that divorce is being celebrated, but that who I am, the parent I am, the way I can support my kids going forward. I am so happy with myself. And that's the icing on top.
That's great. That's beautiful. And last question, because I know there is so much we can talk about here, but I'd love to, I mentioned briefly, this is a question that a lot of people ask me, is narcissism is very over-explained and it's concept creep and all that sort of thing. And I don't believe it's a disorder and I don't know what your belief is, but as a mental health, I don't believe in the biomedical model being the answer that mental illness is an illness and so on. It's more of our experiences and our responses and so on. So narcissism I see as a behavior. It's a description of a set of behaviors that certainly creates a very disordered mind and body network. Now there's so many cases of people that have written into us, for example, and this is why I wanted to ask you this question, who have been living with someone who is really manifesting with these extreme narcissistic behaviors in various different ways, which very often people staying in those marriages and relationships for years, unfortunately. But they love bombing and they're making them feel guilty and bad. And that's kind of how they seem to stay hooked in. And so what is your advice to someone who's potentially in this kind of situation, or have you worked with this sort of situation? I know it's a big question. I mean, answer that in the best way you can.
Yeah. I think that, first of all, there are two things, narcissism and borderline personality, that has been horribly demonized. I would say a very large number of my clients are married to people who are on one or more spectrums. And my ex-husband was on a spectrum and I didn't know it back then at all, but I knew that the behavior was displeasing. So regardless, stop using the word. Don't diagnose. That's not what your background. Talk about the behaviors, right? Talk about the behaviors. And then if you're experiencing those behaviors, there's something going on with you. My therapist said to me, Karen, your pain tolerance is so high. I think you would stay for a lifetime, but it's actually not good for your kids. Like that was my aha. And so for everyone out there who's married to individuals who always blame and take no responsibility, who have black and white thinking, who won't negotiate or be flexible on anything, that's a pretty hard person to be in an intimate relationship with. It all comes back to why do you have such a high capacity for that? Why are your needs not important? A big thing, Caroline, I hear is, Karen, I gave 150%. I gave 200%. And I'm like, and what did you get back? And why did you give for years or decades while you got nothing back? Let's stop labeling them and look at what's going on with you. That's where your freedom is. And so with anyone, no matter who you're married to or divorcing, whatever their issues are, if you could have changed them or controlled them, you wouldn't be divorcing. So here you are. Yeah. What do you want to do? It's time to shift the focus to you, to get the strength, the skill set, the strategy, the mental health and awareness so that you can figure out what your next step is. And so that you can help your children. So my children have their own challenges, mental health challenges, because of the household they grew up in, because of the DNA that they have. if I don't become the best version of me, how am I supposed to help them? And as I said in the beginning, my desire is to break the generational chains. We all can do that by getting healthy ourselves.
So last question, very quickly related to that. When you ask that question, why did you stay and why did you give the 200%? Can they answer? Are they able to answer?
Yeah, I think a lot of them talk about fixing the other person, or like a big one. I'll say one of the biggest ones is actions and words. But she said, and she said, and he said, and he said, but what did they do? And when people stop and see that their actions are so misaligned with their words, they promised and they love bombed and they did this and they did that. Okay, what were the actions that followed? Nothing. For how many years? For decades.
Wow.
And you're listening to words and you're ignoring actions. Actions speak loud. Pay attention to the actions.
What a great piece of advice, and what a great way to end the podcast. So watch those, or do the actions line up with the words? Thank you so much for sharing today and for giving this really, really great wisdom. I know it's going to help so many people, and thank you for that and for the work that you do. How can people get a hold of you and find you if they need help in this area?
Thank you so much. So the company is Journey Beyond Divorce, JBD Divorce Support. JBDdivorcesupport.com is the website, and Journey Beyond Divorce is my podcast, which has a ton of really valuable information. So either of those ways would be great for people to find us. And thank you so much for inviting me on and having this conversation. I love your podcast and what you do.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining me. We'll put all those links in the show notes. Thank you so much.